Welcome to the Eating at a Meeting podcast. I'm your host, Tracy Stuckrath, dietary needs expert, certified meetings manager, certified food protection manager. I have searched the globe to find people and businesses who are creating safe, sustainable, and inclusive food and beverage experiences for their employees, guests, and communities. In each episode, you will find authentic conversations about how food and beverage impacts inclusion, sustainability, culture, community, health, and wellness. I know that sounds like a lot, but we're going to cover it all. Are you ready to feed engagement, nourish inclusion, and bolster your bottom line? If so, let's go.
Hi, everybody, and welcome to another episode of Eating at a Meeting. I am your host, Tracy Stuckrath, and today I have David Ortega. He is a food economist and associate professor at Michigan State University. And I have brought him on the show today to talk to you about food costs, because food costs are jumping up, and they have been since COVID hit. So I really want to kind of talk to him about what that means for us as individuals, as well as if he can tell us anything about what it means for us as business to business. All right. So, David, welcome to the show.
Oh, thanks for having me, Tracy. Pleasure to be here and talk with you.
You're welcome. And I'm like, and you probably ask, how did you find David? I'm like, well, I use LinkedIn, and I'm like, food economist. And there you were. So and I'm going to start with I asked you this question before we got started, was what do you wish people knew about what you do? And I love your answer and the fact that you say you study what people eat, how it got to their plate, and various factors that affect food's journey from farm to people's plates, and domestically and internationally, right?
Right, yeah.
Yeah, that's amazing.
Yeah, so, I'm in the field of food and agricultural economics, a sub-discipline within economics that studies anything from what happens on the farm, producer decision-making, agricultural food supply chains, and also consumer behavior, and just about everything in between. It's, really enjoy the work that I do. It's about food. We all have to eat. It's very personal to everybody. And as we've seen these last few years, people are paying attention to where their food comes from. Going back to the start of the pandemic, a lot of those disruptions, people rushing to the grocery store to stock up, and fast forward a couple of years, Ukraine, increase in commodity prices, and, we're all seeing prices rise at the grocery store. So,
yeah, my mom even was like commenting on the eggs that we buy, and they're up to $7 a dozen, and because we're buying Pete and Jerry's eggs, but they're up to $7 a dozen.
Yeah, eggs. There's a lot of factors, and I'm happy to jump into why we're seeing food prices rise. It's important to note that, it's not just one thing that's affecting the increase in food prices or food costs. It's a variety of factors that are really coming together, kind of a perfect storm of various things that are contributing and are sort of compounding each other.
That would be great.
Yeah. So, first, we really can't forget about the effects of COVID and the pandemic on agricultural and food supply chains. That led to rises in energy costs, transportation, labor, and tremendous changes in consumer behavior as, various states went into lockdown. People couldn't eat at restaurants. They were rushing to the grocery store to stock up. And, this food system isn't set up to handle those disruptions, overnight practically. And it's, COVID is the largest, shock that I've experienced in my lifetime, and I think many of our lifetimes. So this really started back with the pandemic, and all of these things, energy, fuel, fertilizer prices that are tied to energy prices, especially the price of natural gas is put into fertilizer production, were all rising prior to Russia's invasion of Ukraine. And that really set off commodity prices. So Ukraine, Russia, that part of the world is known as the breadbasket of Europe. They're a major producer of wheat products, grain, and also vegetable oil. So sunflower oil. Ukraine's a major. I'll see the flag of Ukraine sort of represents those sunflower fields. And so that really, was another shock to the system. And it's important to note that when we talk about Russia's invasion of Ukraine and food prices, it's not just the disruptions to exports out of the region. Russia has prevented a lot of grain from leaving the Black Sea ports. For most of last summer, there's the grain deal that's gotten that grain moving. But there were also looking at, it's a global market. And in the wake of the Ukraine invasion and sort of the spike in commodity prices from that, we also saw trade disruptions. So places like Indonesia, China were putting export restrictions on things like palm oil, which is one of the most popular vegetable oils out there. Things like wheat, and that just leads to even more, drastic increases in those commodity prices. And it's also, noteworthy to point out that, those are spikes in commodity prices. And, things like sort of the raw materials that go into food production. But when we look at the price of food, and I might scroll to the next slide here.
Okay, let me put those. No, all right. So we've got this.
Yeah,
that other slide was not on there. Did you need me to put that slide on there?
We'll come back to that. That's not a problem. But so here we have the food dollar. It's we saw a rise, especially in April, May of last year, in commodity prices. And it's important to note that the ingredients in the food that we buy represent a small share of overall food costs. So on average, 15 cents out of every dollar can be tied back to on-farm activities. The rest of the food dollar, so to speak, is comprised of things like processing, transportation, the wholesale and the retail trade. And we've seen costs all along that those nodes in the supply chain also increase. So the disruptions because of the Ukraine conflict are noteworthy, but they affect a small share of, the cost of food, which is sort of the ingredients. And so that's important to note.
That's really interesting to look at the dollar in that way, because you really don't think about it. You're like, I'm paying $1 for whatever it is, right? But you don't realize that that's how it's broken down.
Yeah, and this is on average for all food, right? If we start to get into, things that are, like flour, the farm share is going to be much higher because it's less processed. If you get like cinnamon rolls or sort of processed wheat products, the farm share is smaller because there's much more processing, transportation, and much more value added.
So a Twinkie has a lot more of these things than just a bag of flour.
Right, yeah. The bag of flour, there's still some packaging and processing of the wheat, but not to the extent that Twinkies or some other type of snack like that.
I don't even know if they're still made, but yeah, okay.
I haven't thought about Twinkies in a long, long time.
Yeah.
So, that's one factor. And, we've seen, wheat flour prices today are 25% more expensive than they were a year ago. Bread prices are up 16%. Margarine, right, which is made from vegetable oils, is up 47%. And these are very significant increases. So just to also take a bit of a step back, on average, so food today is 10% more expensive, 10.6% more expensive than a year ago. Groceries are 12% more expensive. And food away from home at places like restaurants is 8.5% more expensive. And this is on average. And if we were to go back to pre-pandemic period, for a few years, sort of the normal, so to speak, rate of increase is around, 1.5%, 2%. So when we're talking double digit, when it comes to grocery prices, it's a pretty notable increase in costs for individuals. So, we have COVID, supply chain disruptions. We have Russia's war in Ukraine. We also have some category-specific events that are affecting specific food items at the grocery store. And the one that I think a lot of people have been noticing in terms of rising prices is the price of eggs. Egg prices as a category are up 50%, 50.
Wow.
And, that's because of, mainly, but there are other factors, the high path avian influenza outbreak. And I'm going to move to this other slide here that shows the distribution of the bird flu outbreaks across the country.
Okay.
And we see that so there's been, over 50 million birds that have been affected, many of them in commercial operations. These are the red circles, and you can see there's a bit of a concentration in Minnesota and Iowa. Iowa's top egg producing state. A lot of turkeys come from Minnesota in that area. And so, we've seen a drastic increase in the price of eggs recently. So 50% for eggs as a category. When we look at a carton, a dozen grade A eggs, we're looking almost a double in price in some areas compared to a year ago. And so these are significant increases, but, this is only affecting, it's avian influenza, bird flu. It affects things like eggs, turkeys, as well as poultry products, although to a lesser extent because there are differences in production method and style.
But if you think about eggs, eggs are used in so many different products.
Right.
And just doubling that adds an additional cost to making a cake.
Absolutely. And, eggs, you have flour that's up in price, dairy products. We'll get into butter in a little bit. These are staple products that people buy and we're coming off of the holiday season, sort of the tail end of the holiday period where there's increased demand. People are baking. We had Thanksgiving a month and a half ago, the holiday period. So, it's affecting everyday items that people buy, on a weekly basis.
Right.
And so then we had, so that's avian influenza. So just to sort of summarize where we're at, COVID, war in Ukraine, avian influenza. And then we also have climate change as a contributing factor here.
Wow.
So, we're last summer and for the last few years, extreme heat and drought out west in California, the Pacific Northwest, where a lot of our produce and vegetables come from, but not just domestically in other agricultural producing regions of the world. Places like Europe had extreme heat waves this summer, and China experienced one of the hottest and driest summer on record. And all of this sort of drought, heat leads to less food being produced, lower yields, productivity decreases, which puts upward pressure on prices. And to look at a couple of examples, we have things like fruit and vegetables as a category are 10% more expensive today than they were a year ago. Potatoes in particular are up 16% in price. A lot of that has to do with drought out west in places like Idaho. And one kind of noteworthy item from the last CPI reading, the Consumer Price Index, which is sort of the inflation reading that we get from the government, is that lettuce prices were up 20% from a year ago, that 1% from the previous month. And a lot of that has to do with sort of crop diseases that might be tied to changing climate, sort of heat stress and drought stress. Another thing that's also noteworthy, and let me go back to this slide here. And this is showing various, the price of food over the past year. And I have November 2022 because that's the last official reading that we have from the government. There's about a month lag in terms of when we get inflation readings. And, we can see eggs are up. The price of butter is up. A lot of that has to do with decreased supply of milk and dairy products. The cost of feed for farmers has been rising. Fertilizer prices at record highs last year and then the year before that. And so, a lot of farmers are exiting the industry and dairy. And then beef is quite interesting here. We all remember the effects that COVID had on the processing plants back at the start of COVID. And so, you see a price spike around, 2020, spring of 2020. But then things like, climate change made the cost of feed much more expensive, price of energy, transportation. And so a lot of producers out west have actually been forced to sell their cattle to the market because the costs were so high. And so there's been a bit of a supply glut, sort of increase in supply. We're seeing that prices have decreased about 5% compared to a year ago. So they're getting cheaper. But the forecast here is that in a couple of years, we will likely start to see the price of beef increase because a lot of the replacement animals that are needed aren't there because they were sold to the market. And so it might seem like good news right now, but I know a lot of my colleagues and economists are predicting an increase in beef and prices in the next couple of years.
An increase in the next couple of years, because some people are saying they've already seen the price of beef go up.
Well, so they saw the price of beef go up, as you can see here, late 2021, this sort of brown curve. But because of those rising costs of production for producers, many of them had to sell their animals.
Gotcha.
So the replacement animals won't be there in a couple of years. You need to sort of expand supply.
And how can I just, because of climate change in this conversation here, where does regenerative agriculture come in? I mean, I know that there's talk with different farmers to change their practices and how we're doing, but we can't feed everybody from small farmers. So we still have this huge food system to do that. But do you see a change in farming to regenerative practices so that maybe we get back to some of these farmers having their cattle?
Well, so yeah, there's definitely efforts, industry efforts. There's a lot of work happening at land-grant universities like Michigan State to sort of come up with more sustainable, climate, friendly agricultural practices. But it takes time to see some of those benefits. And, scientists, researchers have been warning about the effects of climate change for quite some time. And these are manifestations of climate change when we're seeing, these types of shocks to our food system. So definitely, regenerative practices, sustainable practices are needed, as well as investments and research and development in agriculture. Because unlike some of these other factors, right, like COVID, and hopefully there'll be a resolution to the conflict in Ukraine soon, climate change is going to be with us for quite some time, into the foreseeable future. So,
yeah, I definitely agree with that. Yeah.
Yeah. And so, we've been talking about the supply side factors, all of these things, COVID, conflict in Ukraine, climate change, avian influenza, those are all supply side factors. But one other factor that has gotten, less attention, part of that is because it's a very fluid situation, right? We're getting data. We're trying to understand what's happening. Is on the demand side. And I'm going to fast forward here. So when we look at the demand for food, we've also seen increased consumer spending. So compared to 2019, consumers in 2020 spent more on food, accounting for inflation, both at home, so groceries, and away from home at places like restaurants. And, part of this can be attributed to some of the excess savings that households accumulated during the pandemic, where travel, take vacations, and those things. And so it's not all supply side. It's not just a supply side story. There's also increase in demand and increase in spending on food, which all puts upward pressure on prices.
That's amazing. So this is the percentage change from 2019 to 2022 in these different. Okay.
Yep.
That's amazing.
That and so, you see here that, consumers have been spending much more on food than they have. That's even accounting for inflation here. We're looking at a sort of percent change. And so, that's increase in demand for food, and that puts upward pressure on prices.
Right, because you supply, I remember this from college a long time ago, supply and demand, when there's more demand for it, the supply goes down, which raises costs, et cetera. Yeah.
we have both. It's a demand shift that we have, and so when you have, if you think back to your Econ 101, you have a demand shift. That's a move along the supply curve. So that's an increase in prices. It's a shift to the right in demand. So, but we also have a supply shock. So the supply curve is also shifting, reducing because of these shocks, and prices have nowhere to go but up. In that case, when you have both of those movements. So it's a very complex,
right? Yeah.
Story. It's not just one thing. It's not just what's happening in Ukraine. It's sort of a combination of factors, and things like transportation costs have been going up since before COVID, and fuel, fertilizer, all those prices have been on the rise for quite some time.
That's mind-boggling because we don't think about it. We just think about going to the grocery store and buying our food, and we notice that our Pete and Jerry's eggs have gone up from $6 to $7 or $5 to $7, over the course of whatever. But and you forget about demand. Like, hey, when more and more people are going out, but then you think restaurants they're hit by COVID, they're not open, right? Or some of them have closed, so the demand for some of them have actually increased because the ones that people normally went to are closed, right? So that adds to all of that too.
Yeah, and so it's interesting. So looking at the market for groceries and the market for restaurants, food at restaurants, it's quite different, right? So, and I don't want to get into too much economic terminology here, but when we look at the market for food at the grocery stores, what we like to think of demand being relatively more inelastic, meaning that, if you have increase in costs and the price of food goes up, you're not going to get that much of a reduction in the amount of food that people buy, because food is a necessity. So you have to buy food. It's a requirement for, everyday life to have food. But when we look at food at restaurants, right, it's demand for going out to eat is relatively more elastic, meaning you need food, but you don't necessarily need to get food from a restaurant. And so, that has implications, sort of the nature of demand for how much grocery operators or store owners can pass on the higher cost to consumers. And restaurant owners. So if a restaurant owner is facing higher costs and they have to be passed on to the consumer, then they're going to lose customers because people will just simply stop eating out at a restaurant and, switch to just having their meals at home. And there's other factors at play, obviously. You're paying more for much more than just food at a restaurant. There's services, and we're seeing, labor costs increase. Labor is the number one thing, if you ask anybody right now, or even over the last couple of years, in terms of, your biggest cost is, in the food industry, sort of the cost of labor, anywhere along from, workers on the farm to sort of harvest crops, all the way to people working in grocery stores and at restaurants.
Well, yeah, I mean, and then I'm going to take it one step further. From the restaurant is the convention center, right? Or hotels, right? And I mean, hotel resorts got hit hard, meaning they were slammed, because people used COVID to go on vacation. The resorts got hit, the urban hotels got hurt, right? And so I think the resorts, but again, I'm like, you don't want to raise your prices too much because, I mean, prices at hotels are already expensive. I mean, I think I emailed you that one person that I know was paying over $200 for a gallon of coffee inclusive.
Wow. Yeah.
But I'm like, what? So was coffee on that grid that you had on there?
It's not on that graph, but I can tell you a little bit about coffee. The price of coffee has been going up for quite some time. Ever since COVID, and a lot of that has to do with, climate change. There was a period not too long ago, year and a half, 2 years ago, in Brazil, they got hit by frost, atypical weather that really hurt their crop. And Brazil is sort of major supplier of coffee to the global market. But we're also seeing, increases, energy costs, the cost of processing, transportation costs. I've done a lot of work in coffee in sub-Saharan Africa, in Rwanda in particular. And, trying to get Rwandan coffee to the US, you got to go to the port of Mombasa in East Africa, and then it's going to make the journey across the ocean to California to get roasted or wherever it goes, right? It's quite a lengthy journey. And, we saw freight rates, right, through the roof in the wake of the pandemic. And so all of that is sort of adds on to some of these costs.
Well, and then I just read a quote unquote horror story on LinkedIn about a small producer who was trying to sell their coffee and through a distributor said, hey, you've got this big order, and how they were ordering it, the pricing, but they ended up having to buy back all their coffee to
yeah. And that's, part of some of that, I don't know the details of this particular story, but, supply chain disruptions. It's been tough to get, to find a truck or, to be able to move agricultural and food products because of all the supply chain snarls. And not just here, but, what happens in China, what happens in other parts of the world where it's a global market, right? And so what happens there, there's demand. If they're going into lockdowns or they're reopening at the moment, that's going to have implications for trade and logistics.
And we forget that and I was talking to somebody about this, but we do forget that our food didn't come from the farmer down the street, right? And it is coming from Ukraine and I remember, because you mentioned at the very beginning about like other countries that were putting on holds. Like I remember rice being said, whatever country had the demand for rice. And like, if you hadn't ordered your rice before COVID hit, then you're screwed, right? We're not taking any orders.
Yes. What happens, when it comes to the price of vegetable oil, right? So we think of vegetable oil, it's not just what we use to sort of fry our eggs sometimes or to bake, but it goes into the production of a lot of processed foods, things like palm oil, sunflower oil. And so Indonesia, when they saw the prices rise, right, they put a ban on exports just to keep their domestic prices low. But, those things don't work, right? Those trade restrictions, and that just sort of exacerbates the problem and leads to even higher prices in the global market. And so...
Did you see any relief?
Well, so the good news is that it looks like, and I'm pretty confident we'll get another reading here in a couple of weeks, that the rate of price increases for groceries seems to have peaked back in August. Okay. And so now it's important to also sort of explain a little bit about what inflation really means.
Okay, yeah, that would be great.
Inflation is the rate of increase in prices over a period of time. So how fast are prices rising? So because the inflation rate starts to come down, it doesn't mean that things are getting cheaper. It just means that they're not rising in price as quickly. And so, in the chart that we had up a minute ago, we see that, right, the price of, the rate of inflation in beef is negative 5%. So beef prices are decreasing compared to a year ago. You always have to put it into perspective in terms of a time period. But, if we have egg prices go from, say, 50% to down to 30%, that's a good, direction to be headed in, because we're not seeing as rapid of a price increase, but it doesn't mean that things are getting cheaper. So I think we're moving in the right direction, but I think it's just going to take resolving a lot of these factors before we start to sort of see meaningful change in terms of getting prices back to much more reasonable levels.
Well, that's good. And is a reasonable level back to 2019 prices or?
Well, so
2005 prices?
Well, so yeah, there's a lot of uncertainty. As I mentioned, I think at the beginning, the rate of increase in food prices before sort of the world changed in late 2019, 2020 was around, say 2%, right? So now we have food prices, double-digit increase. And so, the USDA, I have the numbers here. Their forecast is that grocery prices will be between 3 and 4% rate of increase for this year now, 2023.
Versus this 49% or?
No. The 49% is eggs.
Okay.
Versus, for 2022, it's going to be between 11 and 12%. We'll have the final reading in a couple of weeks. So
okay,
that's a forecast. It's, there's a lot of uncertainty. So a lot remains to be seen. When the forecast came out a year ago, no one predicted that, Russia was going to be invading Ukraine.
Right.
No one predicted the magnitude of the bird flu outbreak this year, which is now the largest in U.S. history. It surpassed the one about 7 years ago in 2015, just in the last couple of months. So, I like to be optimistic, but there's also a lot of uncertainty.
Okay, so I don't know if you can talk about this or whatever, but subsidies for food products that are grown but not used for people consumption, they're used for animal consumption, but also trying to get food subsidized that we actually eat. And I don't know where my question is going, but how does that impact us, right? I mean, when we're looking at and I think I know all of these things in my head, and I'm going to try to pull them together here. Climate change and looking at going to wind turbines and alternative fuel methods, will that help food costs? Or, I mean, do we currently just pay too less for our food already?
Well, so, I mean, it's important to sort of take a step back, right? So, our food industry or food sector is sort of built on sort of the premise that, we're building an affordable food supply, right? We enjoy one of the safest, much more affordable, abundant food supplies of just about any country in the world. So these food price increases are noteworthy and they're affecting families. There's no doubt about that. But it's we also have to sort of keep in mind that our system, and it has flaws, obviously, like any system. It's been fairly resilient in the face of the biggest shocks that we've seen in our lifetimes and generations. And so there are changes that can be made on the margin to make our system much more efficient and much more resilient. But when it comes to subsidies, they're subsidizing grain, right, which goes into the feed of livestock products. It's a rather complicated system, and stopping that support, I don't think is really going to change, or sort of the shifting of the use of sort of grain for energy. It has some effect, but it's sort of good to keep the broader picture in mind.
Gotcha. So how is consumer behavior changing as a result of this? And I've read studies from the International Food Information Council on individuals wanting fair labor practices. They want to know where their food is coming from. They want to be a lot more conscientious of what they're buying so that it doesn't hurt the planet, etc. But that combined with the cost of food, which of course the cost of food is built into climate change, how do you see behaviors changing?
Yeah, so when we look at industry data, so point of sale data, we're seeing, especially in the last couple of months, that consumers are bargain hunting. They're shopping around more. They're making much more frequent trips to the grocery store, a lot more price comparison, less of the stocking up trips that we saw earlier on in the pandemic. We're also seeing increase in demand for private labels or store brands, which are sort of sold at a lower price point and a more affordable for consumers. A lot of sort of trading out, fewer splurges at the grocery store compared to earlier on. And also trading down, you might have gone in both product and at the retail level. You might have gone to a sort of high-end grocery store. Now you're thinking much more of that value-oriented supermarket. And what I do want to pull up is that a lot of these changes are mainly being driven by low-income households and individuals. And these are the households and individuals that really are bearing the brunt of these increases in food prices and the cost of food, because they spend much more of their income on food than some of the higher income individuals. So the poorest 20% of American households spend over a quarter of their income on food. So it's a pretty we see here sort of the lowest quintile share of percent of income spent on food, just over 30%. So when we start to see increases, double-digit increases in grocery prices, these are the individuals that are going to be feeling those price hikes the most, and they're the ones that are having to make adjustments in order to be able to put food on the table.
Okay, food spending and share of. Okay, all right. So the spending is $4,000 annually on that lowest, but it's 30%, just over 30%, like you said, of their paycheck.
Correct. Yep.
Wow.
Yeah.
That's amazing. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, this figure tells a lot in terms of who is bearing the brunt and affected the most.
Yeah, especially when the two lines, the green line goes this way and the yellow line goes that way when you're looking at it. Yeah. Wow.
Well, so those are the types of changes that we're seeing when it comes to changes in consumer food purchasing behavior.
Well, and it lends itself then to also thinking about what kind of food we're buying, right? Especially when sometimes that processed food, and I'll use a Twinkie, just to use that, is cheaper than buying a bell pepper, right? And so, but then, which has all these then other ramifications of what it means to our society, the health of our society, doctor's visits, drugs, medicine, not drugs, things like that, which is a whole nother conversation. But I mean, it makes those processed foods a lot more appetizing because they do cost less money. Right.
Yeah, right. So we can spend a whole nother episode talking about that. But there are definitely implications towards the availability of healthy foods versus processed foods, and sort of what that means for what people buy, especially sort of at the lower end of the income spectrum, who are sort of hard pressed for making ends meet, and sort of not just food, but housing and other things. So.
And I do understand that you focus more on the consumer side, right? But that business to business side, I mean, I guess when just even using restaurants as an example, they have a larger spread to spread out the cost, right? So they only, because you did say that restaurant expenses is only up 8.5% because they can spread it across. Is that right?
Well,
am I understanding that right?
Yeah. So I mean, there's a lot of reasons for that. They're not as able to pass on the costs without customers, say, than a grocery store would be. Right. But we've also seen in the last couple of months that the month-to-month changes have been higher for restaurants, and some of that is also demand-driven. People are much more comfortable now going out to eat, and so some of those changes in behavior as well, than compared to about a year or two ago.
Right. Okay. So what can we do? Do we need to go buy from our local farmer?
Well, so, it pays to shop around. I know I've spoken to a number of individuals about rising egg prices, and, price of eggs is, record highs at the grocery store, but you may have sort of the farmer that isn't being affected by some of these supply shocks. And so, that's not the story across the country as a whole, but it may help depending on the region that you're in. Right. But it does really pay off to shop around, look for deals. A lot of, grocery stores are offering promotions to draw customers in. We saw that over the holidays, sort of the loss leader type of pricing strategy. You can get the turkey. I think some stores were even giving you the turkey for free if you spent an X amount, right? That you in the store, and you make up the difference through other products. But yeah, it's a tough situation, especially for low income households. But also behavioral things. How, don't go grocery shopping when you're hungry. Don't take the kids. That shows that you tend to spend more and those types of
right.
things.
Yeah,
But,
I think I'm guilty of that too. Yeah.
yeah, and I know when I bring my daughter grocery shopping, she's just putting a shopping cart. Yeah, right.
Okay, so I have a very offshoot question here. Looking at dietary restrictions, right?
Mm-hmm.
Individuals who are vegan or gluten-free and specifically, or food allergic, right?
Mm-hmm.
Those prices, the price of amaranth or the price of buckwheat or rice flour, etc. There's an organization that shows how drastic a difference it is for those products versus our standard commodities.
Mm-hmm.
Is there going to be a balance in that ever?
I think once we address some of these factors, right, I think we'll get a much more reasonable level of sort of price changes. I'm sort of less familiar with some of the items for in terms of dietary restrictions, but when you look at something like organic produce, sales have looked like they've been higher. But it's because the price has gone up. The quantity that's actually sold has decreased because people are cutting back. And so, it's when you look at revenue or sort of sales of these products, it could either be driven by changes in the quantity that's being purchased or the change in price. That's something to keep in mind. But I think once some of these factors start to get resolved, especially the supply chain issues that have made it difficult for distribution of food. I think it's things will become much more, and I hate to use the word, but hopefully back to a new normal, so to speak.
Right.
And another thing on that note that's worth pointing out is that there's been a lot of especially at the global level, talk of the food crisis, right?
Right.
And it's not because of a lack of food. There's plenty of food out there to feed everybody in the world. It's really a crisis of affordability and availability. So making sure that people have food, that they can afford and when they need it. And so that's, we're not running out of food. You might see an empty case of eggs at the grocery store. It's not because we're having an egg shortage. It's just, market forces are going to adjust, and it might just be a temporary stock out that will get resolved.
Well, and that just goes to talk. I had a woman who runs Eat Greater Des Moines, and it's a food rescue company organization that when we order too much food, we'll come and pick it up, and we have to get better at doing that, because I think it's also looking at the waste aspect of it in our entire food system.
Right.
Of making sure that we can get it from spot to spot without.
Yeah, and food banks, food pantries have played a tremendous role, over the last couple of years in making sure that, there is availability for some of our, lower income neighbors and households.
Yeah, and I think her name's Aubrey Alvarez, and that she was talking about even community refrigerators too. It's like, hey, if you're going out of town or you have, take your food to the community refrigerator, so other people can utilize it, so it doesn't go bad, right?
Yeah, and and especially in this period of sort of elevated and prices for food, just making sure other things that you can do is don't buy more food than you need. And that sort of helps cut back on waste.
Right.
Do sort of an inventory of what you have in the pantry, and take a list with you to the grocery store and try to stick to it as best as you can. That can also help sort of cut down on costs.
Yeah, I actually made fried rice last night from leftover rice, broccolini, asparagus, and egg. Yeah. So, hey, why not? Right? And shrimp. Yeah. I just used ingredients from 4 different dishes. Yeah, it was great. This has been really intriguing, and it's hard because, and especially for my listeners who are meeting planners, this is going to help them really in their at home and understanding that. But I think it will also help understand where the factors come in when we're talking to caterers and restaurateurs, right? And hoteliers, because hopefully they're looking at how they can spread the costs across the board so that it's not impacting as much.
Right. Yeah. And looking at sort of business to business, things like distribution of food, labor costs, are going to also be playing a part.
Right. Yeah. And they're eating I've talked to some chefs, and they're eating some of those rising costs so that they're not passing on the food costs to us, because they do realize that the food costs are already high.
Right. And, it might be, I'm less familiar with that sector, but it's sort of a much more elastic type of demand curve, where if they raise the price up so much that, they're going to lose business because of it.
Yeah.
But there's a limit.
Right. Can you put that dollar picture back up there? Because I think that's really...
Yep. That one there?
Yeah. I mean, I just think that's really interesting to show that, farm production is 7.4 cents. Food processing, packaging, transportation, wholesale trade, retail trade, food services, energy, finance and insurance, advertising, and other.
Yeah.
I
also... So, a lot of this information in this graph comes from the U.S. Department of Agriculture, their Economic Research Service, a government organization that puts out very timely information and analysis such as this. And so... that's where this information comes from.
Okay, that's great to know. Well, David, thank you so much. Oh, actually, I have one final question. I know we're going to run. Can you tell me, what does a safe, sustainable, and inclusive food and beverage experience look like to you? And especially, it's interesting to ask you that question as somebody who studies food costs.
So, to me, I'll answer it from a researcher perspective. Right?
Okay.
But when you look, and this is work that I've done and some other colleagues have also looked at, in terms of what consumers care about when it comes to food, there's sort of a strand of the academic literature that focuses on food values. And so, the things that people care the most when it comes to food are things like safety, whether the food is nutritious, whether it's tasty. So we care a lot about the taste of our food, as well as the price of food. Right, those tend to be sort of the top food values that people point to, and then on the other end of the spectrum, the ones that people care less about, not that they're not important, but it's just how they view the food system, are things like fairness, novelty, where food comes from in terms of the origin, and we tend to see that that's sort of a general pattern. And I've done some of this work in China, and those values shift a little bit, but they're, predominantly food safety is sort of big there. Nutrition is, a major sort of driver of people's preferences and behavior. So I think, in terms of your question, just sort of having access to affordable, safe food that sort of meets the need of each of us as individuals. I have my own set of preferences that are, I'm sure, different from yours or anybody else who's listening. And I'm just, being able to go to the marketplace and find something that fits not just our preferences, but also our budget is, I think, part of having a thriving and also sustainable food system.
Awesome. That's great. Thank you so much. Well, everybody, David, I really appreciate you being here. Food economics is a big topic, and I think you helped bring it down a little bit so we can all understand it some more. And I really appreciate you talking to us today.
Great. Thanks so much, Tracy. Appreciate it. It was a great conversation. Thanks for having me.
You're welcome. And everybody, thank you so much for listening. This is the Eating at a Meeting podcast. We're here on every Tuesday. A new episode drops. And if you want to listen to it live, we are Wednesdays at 12 o'clock on Facebook, LinkedIn, Twitter, and YouTube. So stay tuned. And until then, stay safe and eat well. Thanks. Thanks for listening to the Eating at a Meeting podcast, where every meal matters. I'm Tracy Stuckrath, your food and beverage inclusion expert. Call me and let's get started right now on creating safe and inclusive food and beverage experiences for your customers, your employees, and your communities. Share the podcast with your friends and colleagues at our Eating at a Meeting Facebook page and on all podcast platforms. To learn more about me
and receive valuable information, go to tracystuckrath.com. And if you'd like more information on how to feed engagement, nourish inclusion, and bolster your bottom line, then visit eatingatameeting.com.